Picture this. You're standing in Alexandria in 30 BCE, watching the last pharaoh of Egypt take her own life. Cleopatra VII, brilliant, multilingual, politically savvy, becomes the face of ancient Egypt in popular imagination. But here's what will blow your mind. When Cleopatra ruled Egypt, the Great Pyramid of Giza was already more ancient to her than she is to us. Think about that for a moment. The pyramid was built around 2580 BCE. Cleopatra died in 30 BCE. That's 2,550 years separating them. We're only 2,054 years removed from Cleopatra's death. Egypt's history doesn't begin with the pharaohs you know. It doesn't even begin with the pyramids. When we talk about ancient Egypt, we're discussing a civilization that spanned over 3 millennia, longer than the entire history of Christianity. The Egypt of the pyramid builders was as distant and mysterious to Cleopatra as medieval knights are to us today. The first unified Egyptian kingdom emerged around 3100 BC under Pharaoh Menes, who joined Upper and Lower Egypt into a single realm that would endure for over 3,000 years. To put this in perspective, if Egyptian civilization were a person, it would have been born before Stonehenge was built and died after the Roman Empire had conquered most of Europe. During its Old Kingdom period, the age of pyramid building, Egypt developed technologies and administrative systems that wouldn't be matched anywhere else in the world for centuries. They created a written language, developed complex mathematics, performed successful brain surgery, and built monuments that still confound engineers today. The precision of the Great Pyramid is so exact that its base perimeter divided by its height equals pi to an accuracy that wasn't achieved elsewhere until the Renaissance. But Egypt's greatest achievement wasn't architectural. It was cultural continuity. While empires rose and fell across the ancient world, Egypt maintained its essential character through invasion, occupation, and internal collapse. The hieroglyphic writing system remained virtually unchanged for over 3,000 years. Religious practices that began in the pre-dynastic period were still being observed when the Romans arrived. This wasn't stagnation. It was something far more remarkable. A civilization so confident in its identity that it could absorb foreign influences without losing its essential character. Now shift your gaze south, beyond the traditional borders of Egypt, to the Kingdom of Kush in what is now Sudan. Here's a story that most history books skip entirely. For nearly a century, Egypt was ruled by African pharaohs from the south who considered themselves the true heirs of pharaonic tradition. The Kushite rulers of the 25th dynasty didn't conquer Egypt as foreign invaders. They liberated it as rightful successors. When they marched north around 750 BCE, they found an Egypt fragmented by civil war, its ancient traditions neglected, its temples falling into ruin. The Kushite kings Pi, Shabaka, and Taharka didn't just rule Egypt, they revived it. They restored the ancient temples, revived forgotten religious practices, and built pyramids in the classical style when Egypt itself had long abandoned pyramid construction. Taharka, the greatest of the Kushite pharaohs, ruled an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to the confluence of the Blue and White Niles, a distance of over 2,000 miles. His reign marked a renaissance of Egyptian culture, but with distinctly African characteristics. Kushite art depicted pharaohs with clearly African features, and their religious practices blended Egyptian traditions with indigenous beliefs from deeper in Africa. The Assyrians eventually drove the Kushites back to their southern homeland, but the kingdom of Kush survived for another 1,000 years, maintaining pharaonic traditions long after Egypt itself had fallen to foreign rule. While Alexander the Great was conquering the Mediterranean world, while Rome was building its empire, while Han China was unifying East Asia, the kingdom of Kush was quietly preserving the oldest continuous royal tradition in human history. Fast forward to the highlands of Ethiopia, where another African empire was writing a story that would span nearly 2 millennia. The Ethiopian Empire didn't just survive the rise of Islam, the Mongol invasions, and the age of European colonialism. It thrived through all of them, maintaining its independence when virtually every other African kingdom fell to foreign rule. Ethiopia's story begins in the ancient kingdom of Aksum, which by the 3rd century CE controlled trade routes linking the Roman Empire with ancient India. Aksumite merchants traded in silk, spices, gold, and ivory across the Red Sea and Indian Ocean. The kingdom was so wealthy and powerful that it minted its own coins. Found today in archaeological sites from Sri Lanka to Britain, and erected massive stone obelisks that still stand today, some over 80 feet tall and carved from single blocks of granite. But Ethiopia's most remarkable achievement was its early adoption of Christianity. When King Ezana converted around 330 CE, he made Ethiopia one of the first Christian nations in the world. Decades before Rome officially adopted Christianity, centuries before most of Europe was converted, Ethiopian Christianity developed its own unique characteristics, blending Orthodox doctrine with indigenous traditions and producing illuminated manuscripts, rock-hewn churches, and religious art that influenced nowhere else in the Christian world. The Church of St. George in Lalibela, carved entirely from living rock in the 12th century, represents architectural achievement that rivals anything built in medieval Europe. Yet how many people learn about Ethiopian achievements when they study medieval Christianity? How many know that Ethiopia maintained diplomatic relations with medieval Europe, sending embassies to Rome, and receiving European visitors who wrote in amazement about this sophisticated Christian kingdom in the heart of Africa? When European colonialism swept across Africa in the 19th century, Ethiopia stood alone as the one African nation that successfully resisted conquest. The Battle of Adwa in 1896, where Emperor Menelik II decisively defeated Italian forces, sent shockwaves across the colonial world. Here was proof that African armies could defeat European powers using European weapons and tactics, that African leaders could outmaneuver European diplomats, that the assumption of European superiority was just that, an assumption. But perhaps the most misunderstood of all African empires is one that was built to impress. In what is now southern Nigeria, the Benin Empire constructed one of the most remarkable urban complexes in human history. When European visitors first arrived in Benin City in the 15th century, they found a metropolis that rivaled any city in Europe for size, organization, and sophistication. The Benin earthworks, a system of defensive walls and moats surrounding the capital and extending into the countryside, represent one of the largest earthwork construction projects in human history. The total length of these earthworks exceeds 16,000 kilometers. To put this in perspective, that's longer than the Great Wall of China. These walls weren't thrown up hastily for defense. They were carefully planned urban infrastructure, defining neighborhoods, protecting trade routes, and demonstrating the state's ability to organize massive construction projects. Inside these walls, Benin City operated according to sophisticated urban planning principles. The city was laid out in a precise grid pattern, with wide boulevards leading to the royal palace, specialized quarters for different crafts and trades, and an elaborate system of drainage that kept the streets clean and dry even during the rainy season. The royal palace complex alone covered 25 hectares and contained hundreds of buildings, courtyards, and galleries decorated with the bronze plaques that would later make Benin famous in European museums. The famous Benin bronzes, actually brass plaques and sculptures created using the lost wax casting technique, represent artistic achievement that impressed even European visitors accustomed to Renaissance art. These weren't primitive artifacts, but sophisticated works of art that demonstrated mastery of metallurgy, sculpture, and narrative composition. The plaques told the story of Benin's history, depicted court ceremonies, and celebrated military victories with a level of detail and artistic skill that rivaled anything produced in contemporary Europe. Yet when British forces invaded Benin in 1897, they described their mission as bringing civilization to a savage land. The thousands of bronze plaques, ivory carvings, and other artworks they looted from the royal palace told a different story. One of a sophisticated civilization that had been creating masterpieces of art and architecture for centuries before Europeans arrived. But these ancient powers, Egypt with its impossible longevity, Kush with its resurrection of pharaonic glory, Ethiopia with its Christian resistance, and Benin with its urban magnificence, represent only half of Africa's hidden imperial legacy. Across the continent, other empires were writing equally remarkable stories, building stone cities without mortar that still stand today, creating trade networks that connected 3 continents, and accumulating wealth that made their rulers the richest people on earth. These are the empires that didn't just survive in Africa's challenging environment. They transformed it, leaving behind monuments and mysteries that force us to completely reconsider what we think we know about the medieval and ancient worlds. In 1324, a caravan unlike any the world had ever seen departed from the city of Niani in West Africa. Led by a man whose wealth would make today's billionaires look like paupers, this procession of 60,000 people, including soldiers, merchants, slaves, and scholars, began a journey that would reshape the global economy and put a previously unknown African empire on every map in the known world. Mansa Musa, ruler of the Mali Empire, was undertaking his Hajj to Mecca, but this wasn't just a religious pilgrimage. It was the most spectacular display of wealth in medieval history. When Musa's caravan reached Cairo, the established economic capital of the Islamic world, he distributed so much gold to the local population that the price of the precious metal didn't recover for over a decade. Contemporary accounts describe Musa giving away gold by the handful, funding the construction of mosques, buying supplies for his massive entourage, and casually dispensing what amounted to a small nation's treasury. But here's what most people don't realize about Mansa Musa's famous wealth. It wasn't just personal fortune. It was the economic output of the most sophisticated trade empire in medieval Africa. The Mali Empire controlled the gold mines of Bambuk and Bure, the salt mines of Tagaza, and most importantly, the trade routes that connected North Africa with the gold and ivory markets to the south. Every caravan that crossed the Sahara paid taxes to Mali. Every pound of gold that moved from the mines of West Africa to the markets of Cairo enriched Musa's treasury. The capital city of Timbuktu, yes, that Timbuktu, the one that became synonymous with the middle of nowhere, was actually one of the great intellectual centers of the medieval world. The University of Sankore, founded in the early 15th century, housed a library containing over 400,000 manuscripts on subjects ranging from mathematics and astronomy to philosophy and Islamic law. These weren't crude documents, but sophisticated scholarly works, many written by African intellectuals who corresponded with scholars in Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba. When European explorers finally reached Timbuktu in the 19th century, they found a city in decline and declared it a disappointment. But they were arriving 5 centuries too late. During Mali's Golden Age, Timbuktu was a cosmopolitan center where merchants from North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe came to trade not just in gold and salt, but in ideas, technologies, and scholarly works. The city's decline wasn't evidence of African inferiority. It was the result of shifting trade routes, Portuguese maritime exploration, and the rise of new powers that bypassed the trans-Saharan routes that had made Mali wealthy. Now travel southeast to the granite hills of what is now Zimbabwe, where medieval African engineers accomplished something that still puzzles architects today. They built a massive stone city using a construction technique that required no mortar, cement, or any binding agent whatsoever. Great Zimbabwe, the stone city that gave its name to the modern nation, represents African architectural achievement that European colonists refused to believe was possible. When German explorer Karl Mach first described the ruins in 1871, he declared that they must have been built by ancient Phoenicians or Arabs, because the local population couldn't possibly have constructed something so sophisticated. This wasn't just casual racism. It was systematic denial of African capability that would influence archaeological interpretation for over a century. The reality was far more impressive than the myths Europeans created to explain it away. Great Zimbabwe was built between the 11th and 15th centuries by the ancestors of the modern Shona people, using a dry stone construction technique that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of engineering principles. The massive walls, some over 30 feet high and 20 feet thick, were built without any mortar, relying instead on precisely cut granite blocks that fit together so perfectly that the structures have survived for over 800 years. But Great Zimbabwe wasn't just an isolated monument. It was the capital of a trading empire that connected the interior of Africa with Indian Ocean commerce. Archaeological evidence reveals Chinese ceramics, Persian glass beads, Indian Ocean cowrie shells, and gold jewelry from across the region. The rulers of Great Zimbabwe controlled gold mining operations that supplied precious metal to merchants from as far away as India and China. They weren't isolated African villagers. They were sophisticated international traders participating in a global economy. The city's most remarkable feature, the Great Enclosure, represents architectural planning that rivals medieval European castle construction. The elliptical wall that defines the enclosure required over 1 million granite blocks, each individually shaped and fitted. Inside, archaeological excavations have revealed evidence of specialized craft production, international trade, and political organization sophisticated enough to coordinate construction projects that required thousands of workers over several generations. When the Portuguese arrived on the East African coast in the late 15th century, Great Zimbabwe was already in decline, its trade networks disrupted by political changes and new maritime routes that bypassed traditional overland connections. But for over 4 centuries, this stone city had anchored a trading network that stretched from the Zambezi River to the ports of the Indian Ocean, demonstrating African capability for urban planning, architectural innovation, and international commerce that colonial historians would spend centuries trying to explain away. But perhaps the most systematically erased African empire is the one that came closest to changing world history forever. Carthage, founded by Phoenician settlers on the North African coast in the 9th century BCE, became an African superpower that controlled trade routes across 3 continents and came within a hair's breadth of destroying the Roman Republic. Most people know Carthage only through Roman eyes, as the homeland of Hannibal, the general who crossed the Alps with elephants and terrorized Italy for 16 years. But this perspective reduces one of the ancient world's great civilizations to a single dramatic military campaign. The reality of Carthaginian achievement was far more comprehensive and far more African than popular history suggests. By the 3rd century BCE, Carthage had evolved from a Phoenician trading post into a distinctly African empire. While maintaining commercial connections with their Mediterranean origins, the Carthaginians had intermarried with local Berber populations, adopted African cultural practices, and developed political institutions that reflected their unique position between Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. The great Carthaginian families, the Barcids, the Hannos, the Mugos, were as much African as they were Phoenician. Carthaginian trade networks stretched from Britain to the Indian Ocean. They established trading posts along the Atlantic coast of Africa, possibly reaching as far south as modern-day Cameroon. They controlled silver mines in Spain, gold trade from West Africa, and the purple dye industry that made Tyrian purple the most expensive commodity in the ancient world. When Polybius described Carthaginian wealth, he wasn't exaggerating. This was an empire whose commercial reach exceeded that of any other ancient power. The Punic Wars weren't just conflicts between Rome and Carthage. They were contests between 2 completely different models of imperial organization. Rome built its empire through conquest and direct administration. Carthage built its empire through trade networks, commercial alliances, and cultural adaptation. Roman expansion was primarily European and Mediterranean. Carthaginian expansion was transcontinental, connecting Europe, Africa, and Asia through commerce rather than conquest. When Hannibal crossed the Alps, he wasn't just leading a Carthaginian army. He was commanding a coalition that included Spanish Iberians, Gallic Celts, North African Berbers, and troops from across the Carthaginian Empire. This wasn't ethnic nationalism, but imperial cosmopolitanism, a model of multi-ethnic cooperation that Rome would later adopt, but that Carthage had perfected centuries earlier. The destruction of Carthage in 146 BC eliminated more than a military rival. It erased a model of African leadership that had successfully competed with European power for over 600 years. When Roman legions finally breached Carthage's walls, they weren't just conquering another city. They were destroying the capital of the last great African empire that had held its own against European expansion. What connects all 7 of these empires? Egypt's impossible longevity, Kush's pharaonic revival, Ethiopia's Christian resistance, Benin's urban sophistication, Mali's scholarly wealth, Zimbabwe's architectural mastery, and Carthage's commercial genius is something far more profound than their African origin. It's what they reveal about the full scope of human achievement. These weren't isolated anomalies or lucky accidents. They were the products of brilliant minds, innovative cultures, and ambitious societies that solved complex problems in uniquely African ways. When Egyptian engineers designed the Great Pyramid, they weren't copying anyone. They were inventing architecture. When Kushite rulers revived pharaonic tradition, they weren't imitating. They were reimagining what kingship could mean. When Ethiopian Christians carved churches from solid rock, they weren't following European models. They were creating something entirely new. The walls of Great Zimbabwe still stand without mortar, demonstrating engineering principles that modern architects study with admiration. The manuscripts of Timbuktu still preserve centuries of African scholarship that rivaled anything produced in medieval Baghdad or Paris. The bronze artists of Benin created masterpieces that impressed Renaissance Europeans and continue to inspire contemporary artists. The trade networks of Mali connected 3 continents in commercial relationships that wouldn't be matched until the modern era. These empires succeeded because they understood something fundamental about civilization: that greatness comes not from copying others, but from solving your own problems in your own way. Egypt's longevity came from adapting to the Nile's rhythms. Ethiopia's independence came from mastering highland warfare. Mali's wealth came from controlling desert trade routes. Carthage's power came from understanding that commerce could be more effective than conquest. They fell to the same forces that topple all empires: climate change, economic disruption, military innovation, political transformation. But they also endured in ways that their conquerors didn't anticipate. Ethiopian Christianity survived Islamic expansion. Egyptian culture outlasted Roman rule. The architectural techniques of Great Zimbabwe influenced construction across southern Africa. The scholarly traditions of Timbuktu preserved knowledge that would later fuel Islamic Renaissance. When we study these empires, we're not just learning about Africa. We're discovering the full range of human potential. We're seeing proof that innovation, sophistication, and monumental achievement aren't the exclusive products of any single continent or culture. We're reminded that throughout history, human beings have looked at impossible challenges and found brilliant solutions. Whether they were building pyramids in the desert, carving churches from mountains, or creating trade networks that spanned continents. The real revelation isn't that Africa had great empires. It's that greatness has always emerged wherever human beings were free to dream big, think clearly, and build boldly. These 7 empires are just the beginning. Every continent, every culture, every period of history holds similar stories of human achievement waiting to be rediscovered. The question isn't why we didn't know these stories before. It's what other incredible achievements are still waiting to be uncovered, celebrated, and understood. History is full of empires that dreamed impossible dreams and made them real. These 7 African empires remind us that the capacity for greatness is as universal as humanity itself. Subscribe and welcome to the empire.